Hey moms, it is a continuation of our C3 series, and today we're talking about how to walk in wisdom. Do you want to learn what it means to walk in wisdom? How do we reject the wisdom of the world and embrace the wisdom of God? So we are continuing in our series C3 counterculture character as we try to figure out what does it look like for us to raise children who have a character that is that of Christ's. How do we raise them to be young men and women who actually change the world because of the fundamental ways that they live? Today, our character quality we're looking at is wisdom. What does it look like to live in wisdom? In the blog, we talked about Lady Wisdom from Proverbs, but as is always the case on Tuesdays when I teach about the character quality, I want to look how we can see this character quality in the life of Jesus himself. When he walked this planet, God with us, Emmanuel, what did wisdom look like? So we see a lot of examples of Jesus acting with wisdom when he answered his critics, when he told parables, when he healed people. All of those are examples of his wisdom. And I invite you to put on those glasses, theoretically, right? And look when you read the Gospels of how Jesus interacted with people and the wisdom that is so evident. But we need to back up a little bit and talk about what is wisdom and see if we can see that perspective in Jesus' life and how we can take that perspective and live our lives. So I was in a class one time when a very wise Bible teacher talked about the importance of perspective. And it is actually this issue of perspective that is what wisdom is all about. And that is, if you could imagine taking a string and tying it from one end of any football stadium of your choice, from one end to the other end of the stadium. And if you were to take a pen, a Sharpie pen, let's say, after you've put that string up, and you went in and you put anywhere on the string, you put one dot, right? And you step back, that dot would represent your life. You could put another dot for your husband or for your children. You could put a dot on there for me. And when you're really close, you can see those dots. But if you dare to step back just a little bit, you can't see those dots anymore. So what does all of the dot in the string have to do with being wise? Just this. Too many of us live our lives for the dot instead of the line. And we're called to live for the line. And living for the line instead of the dot makes all the difference. See, the line is infinite. It goes on forever and ever and ever. And that is what we're called to live for, not our moment in that forever and ever, but for the forever and ever and ever. We are to adopt the perspective of God. When we live for the line instead of the dot, when we live for the eternal instead of the momentary, it changes how we interact, what we do, what we say, how we live, what we read, what we watch, what we interact with, what we pursue. It changes everything. And that's what it means to live with God's perspective. When we look at chapters in the Bible like Hebrews 11, that is known as the Great Hall of Faith, when you read through Hebrews 11 and you talk about great men and women of the Bible who lived by faith, those are men and women who lived for the line and not the dot. They believed what they had not yet seen, what they didn't even actually take hold of. They trusted that God was faithful and would do what he said he would do. They lived for the line. And that same invitation is for you and for me. That's God's perspective on things. It's not this moment when it just things feel so desperate and the culture says, go ahead, be selfish. God calls us to something higher, something better, not just for ourselves, but for our marriages, our families, our communities, our churches. To live for the line is wisdom. It's God's perspective. So just a few examples I want to give you in the life of Christ. So first of all, let's look for just a moment at one specific instance in which Jesus exemplified this moment of wisdom. And I believe it is when the Pharisees were trying to test him and trick him. And again, this is something you can do as you're studying through the Gospels, is look at all of the different instances when the Sadducees, Pharisees, Herodians, scribes, teachers of the law all tried to get together to gang up on Jesus. By the way, these were not groups that generally cooperated together. But on this instance, when it came to Jesus, they all felt intimidated by his authority and by his claims. And so they literally worked together to try to bring him down. And even scripture documents times when they were plotting to kill him. So not just discredit him, right, but to kill him. And so they were trying to find ways to trick him and get him to say something so that their criticisms would stick on him. And on this one occasion, a young lawyer came to him and asked him this huge question: which is the greatest commandment? And again, we've talked about this a couple of times in this series, but it bears repeating here. The wisdom of God, the wisdom of Jesus in this moment, they were wanting him to pick, not just from one of the 10 commandments, but from the extrapolation of those 10 into 613. Which one, he was asking, is the most important? Because to claim any of them as the most important would have been cause for criticism. And instead of falling for the trick, Jesus knew his motives. He knew his heart. He summarized all, not just of the 10 commandments, but all of the 613, boiled them down to just 2. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. See, when we love God like that, when we love our neighbor like that, we are living for the line and not the dot. We are living by the wisdom of God and not the wisdom of man. See, the wisdom of man, the wisdom of this world says live for the dot. You've only got one life to live, right? This is it. Play hard or go home. This is your moment. It's all about you. You do you. Surely some of these things sound familiar. That is the wisdom of the world. The wisdom of the world says fear man instead of fearing God. And right now, my friends, the focus, the pressure, the intimidation used to make us lean into the fear of man is pretty substantial, pretty substantial. And yet the God of the universe extends his hand to us and says, trust me enough to reject the wisdom of the world and embrace my wisdom. Another instance that I want to look at, and again, not exhaustive examples, but it strikes me if we look in Luke 9, verse 51, it says, when the days were approaching for his ascension, Jesus was determined to go to Jerusalem. So we could spend a lot of time on this just one single verse right here, but it strikes me as so powerful that Jesus was living for the line and not the dot. Jesus was living for the line. Here we are in Luke 9, towards the end of Luke 9, and Jesus is determined to do what? Go to Jerusalem. What will happen in Jerusalem? Well, we know that in Mark 8, 9, and 10, Jesus prophesies that he's going to suffer and die. He tells his disciples what's coming. They don't understand it. They don't get it. Just like you and I often don't get it, right? Because it's not what they wanted it to be. It's not what they wanted. They wanted Jesus at his first advent to establish his kingdom. They were arguing over who was going to sit on his right hand and who was going to sit on his left. They were focused on the dot, the here and the now. And Jesus, it says in this passage, as the days of his ascension were approaching. Look, it doesn't say it's the days of his crucifixion were approaching, and the crucifixion came before the ascension. He knew what he had to do. He knew what he had to go through. He knew why he came. And he was focused on going and fulfilling. It says he was determined to go. He was resolved to go. He was going to do what he came to do. And that same invitation is for you and for me. Are we going to determine, are we going to resolve to do what we are here to do? And you may ask, well, Rachel, what is that? I don't even know what that is. Yes, 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 we do know what that is. There's an overarching knowledge that we can have and that we can lean into every day. We are here to glorify God the Father, and we are here to point others to him. Look, that's a really powerful way to redeem the mundane of every day. Mom, there's not anything that comes across your path as a responsibility or a duty, a chore, or a seeming interruption. Any opportunity that God gives you is an opportunity to glorify him and point others to him. Whether it's your children, whether it's your neighbor, somebody at the grocery store, it's all about everything. Scrubbing the kitchen sink, rotating the laundry, which I've done a lot of today, making dinner, teaching your little ones, changing a diaper, writing a note to a friend, fulfilling your job responsibilities, no matter what it is, Mom. When we live for the line, it means that we are always focused on his glory and pointing others to him. That's what it looks like to live for the line and not the dot. And we see that here in Luke 9, Jesus is determined to go to Jerusalem. But if you take a study of Luke 9 all the way to the triumphal entry in Luke, I think it's 19, take note of everything that he does between the moment that he is so intent. Let's see. Yes, it is in Luke 19. So in the 10 chapters between Luke 9, when his stated determination to go to Jerusalem, and Luke 19, study those 10 chapters and see what Jesus does on the way to Jerusalem, on the way to Calvary, on the way to his death, burial, and resurrection. What did Jesus do? And what you'll see is many people crossed his path. He healed. He saw and healed. He touched and healed. He met the needs of people who were in his path as he determined to go to Jerusalem. Mom, when you and I determine to glorify God in word and deed, there are going to be so many things that crisscross our paths. And every one of those things is an opportunity to bring glory to the Father, to live this wisdom we've been given through him. I made a few notes. He predicted for the third time that he was going to be suffer and crucified. He told the parable of the Good Samaritan, the lost coin, the lost sheep, the lost son, as we know, the prodigal son. He healed a man of dropsy. He healed blind men. He healed the woman bent over. He did all of these things while still focused and determined to carry out what he came here to do. And what he came here to do was to pay your sin debt and my sin debt. He came to do what we can't do for us. Another passage I'd like to call your attention to is over in 1 Corinthians 1, where Paul compares and contrasts, and make a great chart for you, for those of you who, like me, love compare and contrast charts. It's a great activity for us. It's a great activity to do with our kids. And that's this whole idea of the world's wisdom versus God's wisdom. And in brief summary, given our time today, the world's foolishness, the cross is foolishness to the world. It's foolishness. All the cross represents to the world is vulnerability and shame and crude and cruel humiliation. That's what the cross represents to the world. I mean, it makes no sense that a loving God would include a cross in the story. But actually, the cross is the wisdom of God. It's the wisdom of God. It's redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. That God so loved the world that he sent his son to stretch out his arms on Calvary again and to spill his perfect blood to pay the right sin penalty for sin. And that is blood. It was a blood penalty. And Jesus hung on that cross. And the cross became the wisdom of God. See, that's what God is in the business of doing, is turning the wisdom of the world on its ear. The wisdom of the world says, don't be vulnerable. Don't serve others. Don't die to yourself. But Paul here in 1 Corinthians says, that's actually foolishness. The wisdom of God says, die to yourself every day. every day and live for me. God's foolishness says serve others. God's wisdom says serve others. God's wisdom says it's not about you. It's all about the glory of God. Mom, you and I want to train and teach our children to make wise choices and not foolish choices. And the way we do that is not that they're just obeying us, but that they're obeying God. That they're living for the line and not the dot. They're living for eternity, not just this moment. And when we can frame wisdom in that way, we can help them to make the most wise decisions possible. But Mom, you and I need to be practicing this too. Again, we cannot give what we do not have. Mom, I want to challenge you to determine to live for the line, to determine to take on the perspective of God, to glorify him in word and deed, to live for the line and not for the dot, to reject the wisdom of this world and instead embrace the wisdom of God. I'll see you next time.